After the Wehrmacht and the Red Army had invaded Poland in 1939, the Soviets soon afterwards, namely in November 1939, abolished the 4 tank corps. The question is, why did they do this, especially considering that the Wehrmacht's panzer divisions were instrumental in defeating the Polish forces? First off, we need to establish some historical context here. Many of you probably know that the Red Army suffered heavy casualties during the Second World War, especially in 1941. Additionally, the German Panzerwaffe has quite a strong reputation for being a lead fighting force. Yet we should not forget that in the 1930s, the Red Army was in many ways leading not only in armor design but also armor doctrine as well, to quote Glantz. The Soviet Union expended considerable time, resources and energy during the late 1920s and most of the 1930s developing advanced theories, techniques and forces necessary for the Red Army to conduct mobile warfare more effectively at the strategic, operational and tactical levels. As a result, by 1938 the Red Army's force structure included an imposing array of mobile armored forces, including 4 powerful tank corps and numerous tank brigades, whose combat employment in wartime was governed by the well-developed theories of deep battle and deep operations. Note that the tank corps were originally called mechanized corps and renamed in 1938 into tank corps. According to Samuelson, plans for these corps go back to 1932. In March 1932, the Revolutionary Military Council drafted a resolution on new forms of motor mechanization. It noted that the government's decision to produce 10,000 tanks in 1932 created the conditions for swift development of tank construction, and that a determined effort by the industry would make it feasible to count on 16,000 to 17,000 tanks in operation by spring 1933. The draft resolution calculated that the Red Army should be able to deploy 20 mechanized brigades organized into 8 to 10 corps. This means that the tank corps were not just an idea that popped out and then fell out of favor, but they were part of a larger year-long development. So it seems very counterintuitive that they were disbanded at that time, especially since these corps were combined arms formations according to Kavalerchik. In March 1932, the first 2 mechanized corps began to form up in the Leningrad and Ukrainian military districts, each of which included 2 mechanized brigades and 1 rifle machine gun brigade. They also had reconnaissance, chemical, combat, engineer, signals and anti-aircraft battalions, a traffic control company and a maintenance depot. So what were the reasons for the change of mind? Several authors point out that experience from the Spanish Civil War were crucial in the decision to abandon the tank corps. One of them is Dunn. He notes, General Pavlov had returned from the Spanish Civil War in July 1939, convinced Stalin that the experience there proved that large tank units could not operate successfully. Added to the upheaval in the Red Army command created by the purges of 1937 and 1938, Stalin altered the tank philosophy and disbanded the tank corps on the 21st November 1939. This sounds plausible at first, but if one thinks about it, it makes far less sense. Namely for 3 immediate reasons. First, the Soviet involvement in the Spanish Civil War was very limited. Second, the Red Army had gathered experience with tank forces in combat also in summer of 1938 at Lake Kazan when fighting the Imperial Japanese Army. Additionally, third, also in May to September 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, and fourth, in September 1939 during the invasion of Poland. As such, the Spanish experience argument seems rather lacking. Yet let's look at some numbers here. Alexander Hill notes, according to Colonel Krivoshev and his colleagues who worked on the Soviet casualties and combat losses in the 20th century, the Soviet Union sent about 3,000 personnel to Spain to aid the Republicans as advisors, tank crews, pilots, sailors and other specialists, and many tanks were manned at least in part by Soviet personnel. Additionally, he notes about equipment. More significant was the equipment provided to the Republic. According to the first volume of the Soviet Khrushchev-era official history of the Great Patriotic War, started by Khrushchev, between October 1936 and January 1939, the Soviet Union supplied 648 aircraft, 347 tanks and 60 other armored vehicles. Now let us put this in context to the Battle of Khalkhin Gol that lasted several months, not years, and was also far more recent. According to Krivoshev and his colleagues, 6,831 Soviet troops were killed in action or died during casualty evacuation during the fighting in the region, with a further 1,143 missing in action. During the whole incident, Soviet tank troops alone lost 659 killed on the battlefield, with 36 missing and 864 wounded. So the tank troops lost, if we add up the killed in action and missing in action, are 695 men. There's almost double the number of tanks that were sent to Spain. As such, I'm a bit suspicious that the influence of the Spanish Civil War experience in this case, since not only were the numbers very limited in comparison, but the Soviet troops acted mostly in an advisory role during the conflict as well. Similarly, Stephen Zaloga notes as well that the Soviets were rather cautious about drawing conclusions from Spain when it came to large formations. The Red Army's lessons of the war in Spain were summarized in a 1939 study. The study was extremely cautious in drawing any lessons about the use of armor in deep battle, since there were no experience of use of large formations in Spain. Yet what about the Soviet experience with tanks against the Imperial Japanese Army in 1938 and 1939? Mary Habeck notes about the Soviet experience in these conflicts. First, for the Battle of Lake Kazan in 1938. Yet another trial of war had shown that the older ideas about mechanized warfare were erroneous and had to be discarded. One result of the Soviet-Japanese border war therefore was a further undermining of support for gathering armored units into large mechanized corps and strengthening of the infantry's power at the expense of other branches. Which is very similar to the battles of Khalkhin Gol. Internal army analysis of the war concluded that the deep battle idea was flawed despite the evidence of Zhukov's encirclement. The conflict of Khalkhin Gol, commanders wrote, had affirmed that the correct way to win a modern battle was through slow, methodical advance by masses of foot soldiers, closely supported by artillery, aircraft and tanks that would act as more than a moving shield. Of course, this raises the question, why did the analysis come to this rather odd conclusion? Yet there's another conflict we need to take a look at, namely the invasion of Poland in 1939. Although the Red Army saw only limited fighting, quite a lot of the problems arose during this brief conflict, and the performance of the Soviet tank brigades was disappointing. About the experiences, Zaloga notes, the uncontested Polish invasion was the largest employment of Soviet armor until the outbreak of the war with Germany in 1941, and it involved the use of 2 tank corps, 7 independent tank brigades, 4 cavalry tank regiments, and 6 infantry tank battalions, totaling 4,120 armored vehicles. Combat losses were minuscule, only 42 armored vehicles, yet the armored force lost nearly 10% of its vehicle in the first few days of moving into Poland due to mechanical breakdowns, 10 times the level of combat losses. For that, let us jump forward a bit and look at the actual statement from 1939. On 15 October 1939, Voroshilov reported on the Red Army's main military council. In the existing tank brigades, the auxiliary subunits are to be reduced, and the rifle machine gun brigades and rifle machine gun battalions of the tank corps and brigades are to be abolished. The mechanized corps as a cumbersome formation for command and control will be converted into separate brigades, and the existing 4 headquarters of the mechanized corps will be disbanded. Now here's a bit of an issue. Such a tank corps had about 560 tanks each, according to Hill. Yet as the order pointed out, instead of the corps, brigades should be established. Now for those who don't know, a corps is 2 levels above a brigade in terms of size, so the division is usually in between. Yet these 2 brigades were not particularly small neither, to quote Hill. However, the tank brigades created with anything from 238 tanks for those equipped with BT series to a staggering 538 for those equipped with the T-26 tanks were hardly the solution. The new tank brigades did not have the organic infantry and artillery components for the independent action and were not intended to operate alone in the enemy rear. As such, the cumbersome argument makes little sense, because a brigade with 538 tanks for sure is not going to be less cumbersome than a corps with 560 tanks, unless there is a major change in terms of command and control facilities, but those could also be used within a corps layout. Yet Zaloga points out an interesting detail about the November 1939 meeting of the Military Council, because one of the Spanish Civil War veterans was present there, namely Pavlov, that according to Dunn convinced Stalin. Pavlov was the head of the Auto Tank Directorate at this time. While Pavlov's support for Voroshilov's effort to trim the wings of the independent armored force has often been tied to his experience in Spain, the broader political context of this decision cannot be ignored, particularly the lingering effects of the Purge. Pavlov had no personal experience with large armored formations in Spain, never commanding a unit much larger than a battalion. His own lack of success in achieving tactical breakthrough using tanks in Spain may partly explain his skepticism of the use of large armored formations. But he also realized that supporting the view of Stalin's confident Defense Minister Voroshilov was a prudent way to avoid an executioner's bullet, a fate which, it should be recalled, befell his predecessor. This is also the view David Glantz takes about this issue. The Soviet Union seemed to abandon its devotion to the theory of deep operations by abolishing the Red Army's fledgling but potentially powerful tank corps. Ostensibly because Soviet-trained tank forces performed badly during the Spanish Civil War. In reality, however, it did so because Stalin had eliminated most of the Red Army's leading proponents of deep operation theory in his vicious purges of the late 1930s. For a larger context here, one of the most prominent members killed in the purges was Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was once the first Deputy Commissar for Defense. He was one of the leading proponents of the use of tanks. Samuelson points out, the consequences of terror in the army led to a stifling of debate on military strategy and hampered for further development of the new doctrine of deep operations. Mentioning the former theorist Tukhachevsky was anathema. Yet necessity soon led to the establishment of tank corps. Already in summer 1940, they were recreated to the major successes of German panzer forces during the Battle of France. Yet this reintroduction is not without irony, especially if one looks back at the cumbersome argument. The new corps would be composed of 2 tank divisions instead of brigades and 1 motorized infantry division instead of 1 machine gun brigade. As a result, combining the tanks of all these 3 divisions, the corps would have more than 1,000 tanks. Remember, the original cumbersome tank corps had 560 tanks? This also underlines the argument of Maudsley that the doctrinal changes surrounding purges might have a lesser impact than suggested by some historians. Some historians argue that the problem in 1941 was the Soviet offensive doctrine was watered down after the trial and liquidation of Tukhachevsky Group in 1937, and in light of the failures of the Russian volunteers in the Spanish Civil War in 1936–39, and the chaotic advance in Poland in 1939. But in reality, the Red Army held true to its offensive doctrine, and if anything, this orientation was reinforced following the triumphs of the German panzer campaigns in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. Of course, the purges had a major influence yet in many other aspects, something I discussed already in a video on my main channel. To conclude, the why the Red Army exactly abolished its tank corps in November 1939 might never be answered fully, although the official explanation given that the corps were too cumbersome seems lacking in various aspects, since some of the tank brigades had almost the same number of tanks and the recreated tank corps in 1940 were even far larger. Additionally, the Spanish Civil War experience argument seems similarly lacking. The influence of the purges seems to be, according to many scholars, the most determining factor, but then again, even in far less hostile climates, there were always major debates about changes and decisions that in hindsight appeared not particularly smart. Not to mention that we know very little about the personal motivations neither. Well, I hope you learned something new. Big thank you to Andrew for feedback on the script. Thank you to Daniel, Bodo and Jack for sending me books that were used in this video. Thank you to Roman for pointing out me towards Kavalagic's book. Also a big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. As always, source the list in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.